The morning of February 25, 2026 started like any other across the Florida Straits. Warm salt air, calm seas, the kind of quiet that masks just how volatile this stretch of water between the United States and Cuba has always been. Then the gunshots rang out, and nothing was quiet anymore. According to publicly available statements released by the Cuban government through official channels, a U.S.-registered speedboat bearing Florida registration L77-6H was operating near the El Pino Channel off the coast of Villa Clara Province when Cuban border guard troops moved to intercept what Havana described as a vessel in violation of territorial waters. What followed, according to that same official Cuban account, was a gunfight. When it was over, 4 people aboard the American vessel were dead and 6 more were wounded. Cuba went public almost immediately, framing the episode as a legitimate defense of national sovereignty, and confirming that the injured survivors had been evacuated and were receiving medical assistance. Washington received the news like a punch to the throat. The Cuban government's version of events is clean on the surface. Border guards approached the violating vessel. The crew allegedly opened fire first and Cuban forces responded. But intelligence analysts and regional observers immediately began picking the narrative apart. The vessel was reportedly operating no more than 1 nautical mile from the channel marker, a razor-thin margin in waters where the boundary between international and territorial zones is routinely disputed. More critically, Cuba's publicly known naval inventory doesn't cleanly account for the type of fast response surface unit described in the incident. Cuba's catalog fleet runs toward aging frigates, a submarine of questionable operational status, coastal missile batteries, and mine-clearing vessels. The agile border guard boat described in Havana's statement doesn't match cleanly with any publicly documented asset. That discrepancy mattered. It suggested either undisclosed rapid reaction units operating in the area or a version of events shaped more by political necessity than operational transparency. Inside the Pentagon, phone calls started within minutes of the Cuban statement going public. The National Security Council convened on an emergency basis. Satellite imagery covering Cuba's northwestern coastline was reviewed. U.S. Coast Guard and Navy assets across the Caribbean theater were placed on elevated alert status. None of this was in order to shoot, but all of it was in order to be ready. The first 12 hours were consumed by a single overriding question. Who were the 10 people on that boat? 4 dead, 6 wounded. A private speedboat registered in Florida. That combination opened a complicated range of scenarios. American citizens on a leisure run gone catastrophically wrong. Cuban exiles attempting an unauthorized crossing. Something murkier involving smuggling routes. According to publicly available reporting at the time, the identities of those aboard had not been officially confirmed by U.S. authorities and the State Department had not yet issued a formal statement on the nationalities of the deceased. That silence was telling. When Washington goes quiet in the immediate aftermath of a maritime incident involving an American-registered vessel and for dead bodies, it is rarely because there is nothing to say. It is because what there is to say is too serious to say carelessly. Cuban authorities, per their own public communications, stated that investigations by competent authorities were continuing to fully clarify events. They reaffirmed Cuba's determination to protect its territorial waters and framed the entire episode as consistent with the principle that national defense is a fundamental pillar of the Cuban state. The language was formal, measured, and entirely consistent with how Havana communicates when it wants to claim the moral high ground, while simultaneously daring the other side to escalate. That dare landed in Washington at a moment of maximum tension. Throughout early 2026, the Trump administration was executing an aggressive pressure campaign against the Cuban government, tightening economic restrictions, amplifying support for dissident networks, and according to multiple reports, internally setting an ambitious timeline for forcing structural change in Havana by the end of the year. Cuba's military and intelligence establishment knew the walls were closing in. The shooting of civilians aboard an American-registered vessel followed by an immediate and confident public announcement carried a subtext that U.S. analysts could not ignore. This was not Havana cowering. This was Havana pushing back. And it was pushing back in a way that was carefully calibrated to walk the line between provocation and full-scale confrontation. Cuba did not fire on a U.S. Navy warship. It did not target a Coast Guard cutter or a government vessel carrying official personnel. It targeted a civilian speedboat in disputed waters, a choice that gives Havana maximum deniability while still delivering a message that every military planner in Washington would read with absolute clarity. The implicit communication embedded in that choice was chilling in its precision. We can reach your people in your waters at a time of our choosing, and we can frame it as your fault. That level of strategic calculation, if confirmed by subsequent intelligence analysis, would represent a significant escalation in how the Cuban government is willing to engage American pressure. Here is where the facts on record end and where the critical question begins. If U.S. investigators working through intelligence gathered in the hours and days following the incident were to confirm what the early pattern of evidence suggested, that the interception was not a spontaneous patrol response, but a directed deliberate act, that the Cuban surface unit had been tasked and repositioned toward the American vessel's location before the confrontation began, that at least some of the dead were American citizens with no criminal history and no hostile intent, and that Cuba's rapid public announcement was not an accident of transparency, but a calculated act of provocation during a period of maximum bilateral pressure. The question facing Washington would no longer be whether to respond. It would be what kind of response the moment demanded. In that scenario, a military response would almost certainly be on the table. And if it were authorized, here is what analysts believe it could look like. The option that would likely rise to the top would not be an invasion. Nobody in the room would want an occupation. What the Pentagon would most plausibly present is a precision strike package, surgical, scoped, and calibrated specifically to deliver a message in the clearest possible terms, without triggering a full-scale war. The targets would be chosen for both military significance and psychological weight. The San Fuego Naval Base on Cuba's southern coast, the most operationally capable port facility in the Cuban Navy's inventory, would be a primary candidate. The radar and command infrastructure integrated into Cuba's coastal surveillance network would be another. A third element would likely involve suppression operations against Cuba's air defense systems, not to destroy them entirely, but to demonstrate they could be neutralized at will. Every target selection would carry the same embedded message. We are not here to end you today. We are here to show you that we can. In this hypothetical scenario, U.S. naval assets already repositioned during the initial alert phase would move into strike range under cover of darkness. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from destroyers in international waters would cross the Cuban coastline at low altitude, striking fuel depots, weapon storage, and pier infrastructure. F-18s operating off a carrier strike group in the Atlantic would execute precision strikes on the radar complex, hitting hard enough to put it offline for months without leveling it to rubble. The restraint would be intentional and visible, enough destruction to not enough to obliterate. That calculated restraint would itself be the coldest part of the message. We held back. We did this much. Consider what we chose not to do. The entire kinetic phase in this scenario would be designed to conclude within 4 hours with all aircraft recovered and no American casualties. Cuba's state media would go dark. Havana's command structure would be operating partially blind, its surveillance network suppressed, its most capable naval vessels burning at the pier. What Cuba does next in that scenario is the variable no planner can fully control. Direct military retaliation against U.S. forces would be strategically suicidal. Aging Soviet-era aircraft, degraded naval capability, land-based systems that cannot project force beyond the island's coastline. But asymmetric escalation is a genuinely different and dangerous calculation. Havana's most immediate option would be activating intelligence and influence networks across Latin America, accelerating destabilization operations against U.S.-aligned governments, and flooding international forums with condemnation that frames America as the aggressor. Moscow and Beijing would be called urgently. Neither would act militarily, but both could provide the diplomatic cover, economic lifeline, and intelligence support that allow Havana to absorb the blow and reframe it globally as an act of American imperialism. The Russian calculus, in particular, deserves careful examination. Russia maintains a signals intelligence facility at Lourdes outside Havana that has operated in various forms since the Soviet era. Russia has deep institutional memory of Cuba as a strategic asset. It was after all the placement of Soviet missiles on the island in 1962 that brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. A U.S. military strike on Cuban soil, even a limited and carefully scoped one, would force Moscow into a public response of some kind. That response would almost certainly stop well short of military action. Russia's resources and attention are committed elsewhere, but it would likely include emergency military aid packages, accelerated intelligence sharing with Havana, and a sustained diplomatic offensive in the UN Security Council designed to isolate Washington internationally and complicate any follow-on U.S. pressure campaign against Cuba. The deeper variable, and the one American planners would have the hardest time controlling, is what strikes do to Cuba's internal political dynamics. An American attack on the homeland is the single most powerful domestic rallying instrument available to the Cuban government. A population quietly exhausted by economic hardship and political restriction can be rapidly consolidated behind a government that is visibly and literally under fire. The strikes might damage Cuban military infrastructure, but they could simultaneously hand Havana the one political gift that no sanctions campaign can manufacture: a real enemy actively shooting at the island, providing the regime with moral justification for every mobilization and crackdown that follows. History offers a consistent lesson on this point. External military pressure on authoritarian governments rarely accelerates their collapse. More often, it extends their survival. To be clear, the military scenario described above is entirely hypothetical. It represents one analytical interpretation of how events could escalate if the facts on record were confirmed and amplified by subsequent intelligence findings. As of the time of this report, the identities of those killed have not been officially confirmed by U.S. authorities. The full circumstances of the confrontation remain under investigation according to both sides, and no military response has been announced or confirmed. What is confirmed through Cuba's own public statements is that a vessel registered in the United States was engaged by Cuban border forces. 4 people were killed and 6 were wounded. Everything beyond those facts is for now contested, unverified, or unknown. The Florida Straits are 90 meters wide. Tonight they feel much narrower than that. The world is watching a narrow ribbon of warm Caribbean water very carefully, because what happens next in those 90 meters could echo far beyond them. And the next move belongs to